this is the Provoked Prawn, and in this video I'm going to show you how to craft a gaming PC inside the Darkflash DY470. In this video I'm going to show you how to build a PC that looks something like this, and I'm aware I'm using a black all-in-one cooler that might not be ideal for everybody, but I'm going to show you the setup and wiring of this case, and how and why you need to remove the fans and turn them over, because I found them to be problematic as they come pre-installed, and maybe you might need an extension lead for the fan power cables, because this can be a bit problematic as well. I'm going to talk to you about things like that, as well as the other issues I faced with the anti-sag bracket for the graphics card, for example, and all the other little highlights along the way. This is going to be a step-by-step guide on building the DY470, the crafting of it, how to wire it up and set it up to get the fans working, and how to build your PC inside it. So I'll leave timestamps in the description so you can jump to the relevant points of the video. I'm going to show you a detailed setup on everything you need to know. But first we're going to start with a breakdown of the case and all the little elements of it so you can see them before you get started. You'll see it as a removable dust filter at the bottom that you can take out when you need to clean it. And the rear panel can be removed as well, but there's another door there which you need to unscrew in order to access. Note as well that there's no magnetic dust filters at the rear, so this may cause some dust build-up over time, so you need to watch out for that. And watch out for those two little clips on the bottom for reinstalling the door. Now this rear panel, which does a nice job of hiding away the cables at the back, is secured with a couple of screws at the top and the bottom, which you first need to remove, and then make sure you put them somewhere safe so you don't lose them because they are very small. And then this rear panel can be removed. Back there you'll find the instruction manual, which hopefully you won't need by the time you finish this video, but it's there if you want it, as well as all the other things. So for example, you'll see all the cables are tied up for you. Now there's 4 pre-installed fans, 3 side-mounted intake reverse blade fans and 1 rear exhaust fan that you'll see that are already installed for you and wired in, and you could theoretically just plug them into the motherboard. I'm going to show you where later on. But as I said, you will want to adjust those fans a little later as well. There's also the power switch, reset switch, and other connectors. And I'll show you how to set those up and where to plug those in, because that might be a little bit fiddly for you. And then you can see the power cables for the fans here. They're daisy chain fans, so the wiring is actually pretty straightforward with a couple of caveats. Now, the front glass panel I found pretty difficult to get off. I'll warn you of that. It was quite difficult to tug off. I made it look easy there, but I haven't shown you all the clips of me struggling with it, so be warned there. You need to pull it quite hard to get it off, I found. Once inside, you'll find you can also mount a variety of different motherboards, and I'm going to show you a standard ATX build in this case, and that's what you'll see, and I'll leave all the specs of it in the description. As mentioned, you've got these 3 reverse blade intake fans on the side there, and then you've got space for mounting other things. I'm going to put a 360mm all-in-one cooler on the top of the case here, and I'll show you how to do that later on. But I'm not adding in any additional fans in this build, although I have done a separate one where I did put a load of Corsair fans. I'll link to that video in the description if you want to see it. So most of the cables are already sort of tied up for you and connected together. You will see that there's a male and female RGB connection, so the pins on that are 5V RGB. So the rear fans are connected to the front fans in that logic, and everything's sort of neat and tidied away for you, including these cables with the USB-C and USB-A front panel connections, your HD audio connectors, and more. Now I'm going to show you the wiring of the power supply unit, and this is Corsair's RM Shift power supply and the Pro PSU cable kit with some individually sleeved power supply cables that look really nice and are easy to install. I'm going to show you the setup and wiring of each of the cables you're going to need in this build, starting with the motherboard connectors and the 8-pin EPS power cables. So this is a modular power supply with the Type 5 connectors on it, which is a small connector on one end, and it installs in an interesting way because the cables end up at the top of the power supply rather than the side. You'll see what I mean by that in a minute. But for the 24-pin motherboard power cables, you'll see it split on one side into 2 parts, and then the right-hand side in my hand is the larger bit that plugs into the motherboard. So you're looking for the motherboard ports on the power supply end, and you put the 2 connectors into that. You notice there's a little plastic clip on them, so they can only plug in one way there. And also you need to watch out for where they pin into and plug in there, but make sure they're plugged in fully. And then once the system is inside the case, you then put the power cable for the 24-pin part into the right hand side of the motherboard. I'm showing you it here outside the case so you can see it really clearly, so it's easy to get an idea of what that looks like and how you plug it in. Because what you'll notice is there's a little clip on one side that basically notches on to a bit of plastic on the outside edge of the 24-pin power connector. So you need to make sure that's pushed all the way in and clicks into place, and there's a solid connection there. Otherwise, you might find that your PC just doesn't turn on. The other cables you'll need are the EPS power cables that are marked CPU on one end. The Type 5 part that you can see on my left-hand side there plugs in on the power supply end into the ports marked CPU and PCIe, which are near the motherboard ports on the left-hand side of it. And then the other ends plug into the top left of the motherboard. These are CPU power cables that help give your motherboard enough power for overclocking and things like that, but I would recommend plugging them in if you've got the cables and you've got the ports, to make sure you use them. You can see them here, and again, they've got little plastic clips on them, so you need to make sure the cables are pushed fully into those ports and click into place and hook over there. And that's the powering of the motherboard. As you can see, 3 power cables in this instance, and that's basically the same from the majority of motherboards out there, so it's pretty straightforward. Next, I want to show you the SATA power connectors for the SSDs and hard disk drives, and I'll show you where to install those in the case later on if you want to use them, but this is also useful for other things, as you'll see. These plug into the SATA/PATA ports on the power supply end, again with the small Type 5 connector plugging into those ports, and then the rest of the cable has multiple SATA power connectors on it, which is the flat power connector you can see here that plugs into the SSD, like this Crucial SSD, for example. These have an L-shaped connector on the inside of them, so the cable will only plug in one way round. Notice there are 2 connectors on this SSD. The other one is for the data cable that connects to the motherboard that you can see here. That's usually included with your motherboard, so you should find those in the box with the motherboard. You plug that in there, and then you plug the other end into the motherboard on the right-hand side into these ports here that you can see. Usually in the same sort of position on most motherboards, so they should be fairly easy to find. So that's the drive powered and connected to the motherboard. Again, as a reminder, this is all outside the case. You can see really clearly where these things go, but you wouldn't actually do this just yet. Next up is the graphics card powering. Obviously, this is going to be different depending on the GPU you're using. I'm using an Intel Arc graphics card here, which requires the 8-pin PCIe power cables, and we need 2 of them. You'll see these power cables are marked PCIe on the end that plugs into the graphics card, and they're also split into 2 parts, a 6-pin and a 2-pin that need to go together to fit into these ports that you can see on the GPU, which are 8-pin, so there's 2 8-pin power connectors there. The Type 5 end plugs into the ports marked CPU and PCIe down the bottom right there, so you're looking for a PCIe connector basically on your power supply unit of choice. With Corsair ones, they're usually marked like this, and you can see how they plug in there really easily, but again, you need to make sure they're fully seated into those ports. Then at the other end is a little bit more fiddly, generally speaking, when you go to plug these power cables in. So it's split into 2 parts. It's a 6-pin and it's a 2-pin. You need to make sure they're pushed together and then pushed into the port. I find you can basically just notch those things in together and hold them tight as you push them in. You need to make sure these are fully pushed in all the way and neither part of that is loose, because if either of these power cables are loose during this connection, you'll find that your GPU doesn't get the right amount of power and your FPS might be suffering as a result, so it won't be performing properly. And obviously you've paid a lot of money for your GPU, so you want to make sure it's running properly. Now, if you're looking for an even more expensive GPU, an NVIDIA graphics card of the 40 or 50 series, chances are using a 12-volt high power connector or 12-volt 2x6 connector, which looks like this, which has these little tiny pins on it on one end, and the other end might be like this Corsair one where it's got 2 Type 5 connectors that plug into the power supply. So same sort of logic as I've just shown you. On the modular power supply, you're looking for the PCIe power connectors. So you can see on the bottom right here of the power supply unit, these 2 connectors plug in there, and then you've just got a single connector that runs to your graphics card. For the 40 and 50 series of graphics cards from NVIDIA, this is in place of the adapter that's included with the GPU, where you have one end that plugs into the graphics card with then 3 cables coming out of it, usually, which has the PCIe power connectors on it. So you've got this in place of it. It's neater, it's easier to plug in, and as long as it's firmly seated into the GPU, you shouldn't have any problems with it. you need to make sure it's pushed all the way in so that it clicks into place and none of the pins are visible, or none of that plastic that should go into those holes is visible there, so you can see it's fully seated into place, and then you shouldn't have any issues with the powering of the graphics card there. So with all those wires in place, knowing which ones we're going to use, you can then put the power supply into the case and seat it in there. Notice I've got the fan facing outwards, so that'll be sucking air through the back of the case to cool it down. You'll then need the hexagonal screws that are included with the Darkflash accessories box, or the ones that came with the power supply. There should be 4 of them, and they screw into the 4 corners, into the 4 holes to secure the power supply to the back of the case. I'm doing this now so that you can then manage the cables nice and easily and run them through all the various Velcro ties, tidy them up, and make life easier for when we actually go about plugging these into the motherboard once we've installed those things. So you might want to take some time to do that now and adjust those. Then we're going to get into the setup of the motherboard. In this case, I'm using the ROG Strix B850A, which is an AMD motherboard with AMD socket on it, AM5 socket. So you can use the latest AMD CPUs on it. And this is a capable board with a number of nice highlights to it, including Gen 5 support for PCIe NVMe SSD. It has loads of I/O on the back. You can see we've got plenty of USB ports, USB-C, and good Ethernet connections and more as well. But it also has good cooling for your NVMe SSD and that top slot, and a number of other highlights to it. Plus it looks nice, and with that white and black effect on it, it'll look really nice in the build as you saw at the beginning. So we're going to go about the setup of this before putting it into the case, because I find that a little bit easier to deal with, including the RAM, the CPU, and the NVMe SSDs as well. So if you're putting an NVMe in, I'd recommend using this top slot here. This will give you the best cooling and the best speed, because it is the fastest slot on the board. Make sure once you removed that heatsink from the top there that you peel off the little protective sticker so the thermal pads are exposed. Now in this instance I'm using the Crucial T705 limited edition NVMe. This is a Gen 5 drive with its own heat shield, which I can see is massive. So that slots into the port there and pushes in. You'll notice it's upside down on this motherboard, but that's just the way it installs. One thing you might notice if you're using a drive like I am here is that with this one, it's quite difficult to get in because of the thermal pads underneath. Now, I've been asked this question before by other people. You can remove the thermal pads if you struggle with a drive like this, because obviously the heat shielding's on top, so it doesn't really matter so much about the thermal pads below. And normally you'd put that thermal shield that I showed you back on with a normal drive, but obviously you can't with this one because it's got its own heat shield. Then for the CPU installation, you pull the little lever down, you lift the little latch up, and then you gently put the CPU down into the socket. Obviously taking care with this, you need to be very careful to lower that down gently into the socket so you don't bend any of the pins, and then put the lever down carefully and reposition that. Now I'm using Crucial's DDR5 Pro Series RAM here, which is Expo compatible, and it will work with Intel's XMP as well. So whatever you're using, whether you're using an Intel build or an AMD setup like I am, you can use this RAM quite effectively and it will run nice and fast and solid and stable. It slots into the second port and the fourth port on your motherboard. Make sure you get this right. Not the first one, the second port and the fourth one. If you're using just 2 sticks, that's how you need to do it to make sure it runs properly. Now for this build, I'm using the Mystique 360 ARGB all-in-one cooler from Deepcool, which we're going to have a separate video on that I'll link to in the description. But I'm going to show you the setup for this AMD motherboard and the installation there. And we're prepping it now so it's easy to do once we've got it into the case. For this, you're going to need the brackets that attach to the cooler, these little screws to then secure it down. So there's some AM5 brackets you can see me using here in place of the Intel ones that are all the alternative. And then you use the 4 little screws here to secure this bracket down to the cooler. You've got to take care here because as you can see, there's pre-applied thermal paste on the copper plate. While securing this, you need to be really careful you don't damage that thermal paste. If you mark it or ruin it in any way, then it might affect the cooling. So take great care here while installing these brackets. But basically do as I've done, 1 bracket on either side, screws securing it into place, and then use the little plastic cap to just cover it back over for the moment so that it doesn't get damaged during the rest of the build. Now for this install, you'll notice that the fans are already pre-installed onto the radiator, and they're set up in a way where it's going to exhaust air through the radiator and out the top of the case. It comes with this cable that you can see here, which has 3 connectors on one end and 2 on the other end. The part with 3 connectors is going to plug into the 3 fans. So there's 1 clip and 1 connector per fan, and this gives you the RGB and power through these connectors that then have connectors that plug into the motherboard, and I'll show you those in a second. But basically you're going from one fan to the next fan to the next fan and then to the motherboard, and that would be the connection there. So you can see the wiring for them is fairly straightforward with the fans that are set up there. There's 2 cables, one for the 5-volt RGB header on your motherboard and one plugs into the CPU fan header. So we're looking on the motherboard in a minute for those connections, but first I'm going to show you how to install the standoffs as well to prep for that. So in order to do this, you need to remove the pre-installed standoffs that come on the motherboard that you'll see above and below the socket. They're secured there with a couple of screws on each of these, so just unscrew those, remove those clips, and save those, put them in the motherboard box or something so you don't lose them, because you might want them in future. Then you have these little standoffs with the little black plastic bits on them, and then the silver screws on top. Put them with the black plastic bits facing the bottom, secure them into the socket in the 4 corners. So basically these are replacing the screws that we just removed from the motherboard and the standoffs that were sitting there. The cooler is then going to sit over the top of these in a minute once it's fully set up and put into the case. So just to show you the wiring logic of how this works as well before we get that in, the fans that I showed you plug into the CPU fan header, which you'll see here is on the left hand side. It's the grey one. Look for your motherboard manual if you want to refer to it, but you should find us in the same place. And we also want to find a 5-volt RGB header, which is that 3-pin connection that you should find there as well. So with those 2 things, the fans are then powered by the motherboard and they get their RGB lighting effects from the motherboard as well. Now the pump itself will seat down over the CPU, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. But then that's got a few different cables coming out of it as well. One of those cables will need to plug in to the AIO pump header, which is also in the top right near where the CPU fan header is. So you can see that here. That's the little black one right next to the CPU fan header. You'd plug that in there, and that way the motherboard controls both the fan speed and the pump speed in this system. Then you have the 5-volt RGB connection. Now there's a male and female connector here, so you can connect the fans to the RGB connector from the pump so that you can basically chain those together. So if you've only got one 5-volt RGB connector on your motherboard, you can then plug both things into that one port. This makes life a little bit easier, and it might be the better way to do it. Alternatively, you can individually plug the fans and the pump into separate ports on the motherboard. Bear in mind, though, that case fans are also going to need that 5-volt connection as well, so I'll show you that in a second. With that prep done, we're now going about the motherboard installation into the case. Now, I'm using an ATX motherboard here, and if you're doing the same, before you install it, you need to do another step here, which is install 3 additional standoffs along the right-hand side. You find the standoffs in the little accessories box, as well as a tool that you can put on top to help secure them into place. You have 3 here, one in the middle, one at the top, one at the bottom, in line, which go down the edge, and you'll find there's a gap there that you need to put them into. It's odd that these aren't installed, because in most cases I build in, you usually find the right amount of standoffs for an ATX board, but in this instance there isn't. If you're using a smaller motherboard, then you won't have an issue here, but a standard ATX board, you'll need these additional standoffs screwed in. So take the time to do that beforehand. These sit below the motherboard and allow you to screw the motherboard into them to secure it to the case, so they are important. Then put your motherboard into there and seat it down over the top of the standoffs we just put in and the other ones in there. So that there's a total of 9 standoffs below that. So you're going to need to use these little screws on the left-hand side of the accessories box, which have a flat edge on the top of them, and then they screw into those ports and the various different points across there. 3 across the top, 3 across the middle, 3 across the bottom. You secure those screws in, and this should then hold the motherboard securely and firmly to the back of the case. But obviously you do need to make sure those additional standoffs are in there to be able to do this. So take your time to do this and screw this in nice and tight and making sure it's nicely secured and set up there. And then we're going to go about the rest of the installation moving forward, plugging all the cables in that I showed you earlier so that you can see them as well. Watch out at the top left there. Might be difficult to see depending on how you're building it, but there's another one that goes into the top, and then that's that set up. So just quickly, I want to show you something else to bear in mind, and that's the installation of the cooler. So I mentioned this one's going to be top mounted, and I'm putting tubes on the right hand side here. You have options, obviously. You could side mount your cooler, and I've got a separate video on why that might be better. I'll link to it in the description. But here I'm top mounting it and setting it up like this. So we've got intake fans on the side and then exhaust fans through the radiator out of the top. But with this cooler, it's interesting because you have to have tubes on the right-hand side unless you switch the fans around, because the wiring for the fans is on the other side of the radiator. So if you tried, for example, to put the tubes on the left, because you wanted to set up that way, obviously you'd have the mess of the fan wiring there. So you'd then have to take the fans off, flip them round, and re-secure them. You could do that quite easily if this is something you wanted to do, but you'd see the tubes would probably get in the way of that rear fan as well. So this is how we're setting up in here. By the way, there is a white version of this cooler available if you want to have a fully white build, which would be more logical. Then we have the power cables at the rear, as I showed you earlier on. The two 8-pin CPU power cables, run them through at the top right just above the power supply, and try and tidy them up with the Velcro ties. Then they plug in on the top left of the motherboard on the front hand side, obviously, and push all the way in. Make sure you're clicking those into place. Note here, you'll want to tidy these up a bit, because what I found is if they're not tidy and tucked in nicely, they interfere with the CPU fans. You'll see that in a second. Then the 24-pin power cable needs to run through the gap on the side to then plug into the motherboard. Now, this might be a bit more fiddly depending on your power supply unit. With the Corsair one, it's quite easy because these are nice cables. These are premium individually sleeved cables, so they go through there quite well. You can see there's cable combs to secure it as well, make it neat. Make sure you push that into place though, and make sure it's firmly clipped in, as I mentioned before, because you want to make sure that's fully secured. Otherwise, you might find it doesn't turn on properly, and then you can try and neaten up those cables a bit. Now I want to show you the fan wiring for the side fans. So you can see these three fans have one cable coming out of them with some additional connectors. The rear fan also has cables running through here with connectors on it as well. You have fan power connections and the 5V RGB connectors. Now you can connect the RGB connections from the rear fan to the front fans so that they're chained together, and then you can connect those fans to your motherboard so that all four fans are then controlled from the RGB lighting. You do, however, have two fan power connectors that need to connect up to the system fan header or chassis fan header on your motherboard. Now, I found that the rear cable doesn't stretch very far. I had to remove it from where I tied it down and connected it up so that I could get enough length in it. And you can see even now it's still quite short and is difficult to reach. This is why I mentioned you might need to buy some extension leads. This is an optional additional purchase of fan power connection, which basically extends the length of the cable. So this black cable didn't come with the case, it's my own. You have to plug the cable from the fan into it and then run that cable through to the front to be able to plug the power connector in. This is quite odd because it gives you a problem where basically the cable's not long enough. Now this is going to depend on your motherboard, because if you've got a system fan header at the top of the motherboard, it's not necessarily an issue. But all my chassis fan headers and system fan headers are at the bottom of the motherboard on this case, so it's a bit trickier. So you can see there's one down the bottom right here, right where the power switch cables go into, and there are some others around the middle, but basically there isn't very easy access to be able to plug these cables in on this motherboard unless you've got that extension. You'll see there's more in the middle here, so we've got various different chassis fan headers. You might be looking for system fan headers instead on your board, but basically those are the options to plug those cables in. So that's the fan power for both the three fans on the side and the rear one. And then you need a 5V RGB connection that looks like this, which is the 3-pin connector, and try and plug that cable in there. Now this is, again, not long enough. Yes, I showed you I do have one of those connectors on the top right of the motherboard, but I'm going to be using that for the cooler. And you might have others. But what I found is what I needed to do was basically to maneuver the fans around so that there was more length in the cable. Unscrewing the fans from the rear of the case, I then basically flipping them over so that the cable is now at the bottom instead of at the top. This gives you more length to then be able to reach the ports with ease. So it might be something you have to think about. Obviously, it's a minor thing, but it was something that I had to do in this instance to be able to sort this out. There's just not enough length in that cable. It is nice, of course, that these three fans are connected together. Otherwise, in older cases and different fans, you'd need 2 connections per fan, so it'd be a lot more complicated. So this is pretty straightforward in terms of the wiring, but it was a little bit of extra faff to unscrew these and then screw them back in just to get that extra cable length. But you can see now, obviously, we've got loads of cable length going on here, so in theory, it's pretty easy. Once again, I daisy chain the RGB from that top fan so that they're all connected up, and then you just got to connect the power up to the motherboard and the 5-volt connection to the motherboard, as I've shown you, and you've got more length to be able to do this. So this is one option that doesn't require an extra purchase and is fairly easy to do, and hopefully helps you out. So then running those cables through to the front, now I have the length in that 5-volt connection to be able to plug it in. Take care with this, because I found it's really easy to bend the pins on those connectors if you force them too much, so that's something to watch out for. But then you can plug those in and sort out the power and the RGB, and you can see there's still not much length in that rear fan cable. Maybe it might be worth running it under the power supply. Now onto the other connections and show you the setup for those. We're going to start with the front panel connector. Now unfortunately this case has those split front panel connectors with multiple pins on it. So we've got a power switch, reset switch, and then power LEDs. You'll find the connector on the bottom right hand side of the motherboard. Refer to the manual for how they plug in, but I'm going to show you it anyway. You'll see the power LED is marked with plus and minus for positive and negative. If you flip them over, you'll also see there's a little arrow indicator on the back. That also shows you where the positive connection is. So this is helpful because you can then look at the board and see where those plus and minus indicators are on that, so you can line them up. We then have to just plug those individually in to make sure they match the description of the board or what's in your manual. You should find a little guidance in your motherboard manual to show you where these plug in and which connect up. But basically, if you have trouble, you can flip the cables around, work out where that little arrow is and where it shows you the plus connection, so the positive connection for the thing you're trying to plug in this instance, the reset switch, for example. That will then ensure that everything's powered, so you've got your power button will work and your reset button too. Then you have the HD audio cable. This is the 3.5mm jack. That plugs in on the left-hand side. This is much easier. You can see there are pins missing. There's one pin missing on the F audio connector on there, so you can only plug it in one way. So you just have to line the connector up with that and then plug that in. Then you've got USB-A and USB-C connections. Those plug in next to the 24-pin power connector on the motherboard, so you need to just find a little space to run those through to the front so that you can plug those in. You'll see the connectors on the right hand side just below that power connector. Essentially you've got to push those in there. These also only plug in one way. There's a little plastic clip on the large USB-A one, and then a USB-C connection. It'll only go in one way, and you have to make sure it clicks into place, so you don't feel a click when you push it in. You've got it the wrong way around, and then it won't work properly. So that is all the motherboard connections done, and now we're going about the installation of the all-in-one cooler. So what we want to first do is to put the radiator at the top of the case, line up the little holes on the radiator with the runs at the top there, and then use the small screws that are included with the radiator to secure it to the case. You should find there are a lot of screws here, so I'm going to shorten the process for it, but obviously you have to make sure they're all screwed in and secured nicely and tightened up so that the radiator is secured well. Obviously you want to make sure it's in a good position, you're happy with the position of it beforehand, but watch out for this. You'll see the CPU power cables were touching the fan initially, so I had to make sure I pushed them through to the rear a little bit. So watch out if you have the same issue. You might find fan noise from that where that's impacting there. Then we're going to install the cooler over the standoffs that we put on the motherboard earlier on. First of all, don't forget to remove the little plastic cover so that the thermal paste is exposed, and this will seat down over the CPU. And then line it up with the standoffs that we put in there, and then we're going to seat it down over the top. Now be careful not to move it around too much when you do this. You don't want to damage the thermal paste when you're installing it. But then you need to use the thumb screws to secure it down to the standoffs. So one into each corner, go corner to corner so that you're securing it well as you go through and not moving it around too much. I do this by hand to start with, but I would recommend using a screwdriver just to finish them off to make sure they're tightened up. So you need to tighten them until you can't turn them anymore, but don't force it, don't go too hard with it. But if they're a little bit too loose, you might find that your cooler doesn't perform very well. So it can be worth just using a screwdriver there. And then we've got to tidy up all these cables and plug them in. So as a reminder, this one goes to the AIO pump header, which is near the CPU fan connection on the top right of the motherboard. You need to make sure that's plugged in so that the pump is powered properly and your motherboard can see it. And then you have all these other cables. Now you can see there's quite a mess of cables to deal with here. Obviously we've got the ones on the fans that need to be plugged in and connected, but also you've got these additional ones down here which are quite messy. So what I found was a good idea was to just use plastic cable ties to basically tidy these cables up, tighten them together so that they then make less mess and we can run them through to the rear, making it look a bit neater, and then find where you need to plug them in, which I'll show you in a second. I had to use multiple ties across this to tidy this because it's quite a mess and there's quite a lot of cable to deal with. But also it's just trying to keep things tidy so the majority of the front of the case is really neat. And then we can just basically go about cutting the excess of the plastic cable tie away so that it's not quite as hideous, and then tucking it in through the gaps. So what I'm trying to do here is basically run it through this gap on the right hand side of the motherboard so that we can then tidy the majority of it away at the rear and hide it away. Now from the cooler we have two connections which are really important: SATA power and USB connection. SATA power plugs into the same cable as your SSDs and hard disk drives from the power supply unit, and to make sure that's plugged in so everything is powered nicely. The USB connection then needs to run down to the bottom of the motherboard, so through to the front of the case again, and plugs into the USB ports in the bottom middle of your motherboard that you can see here. Usually you'll find two of those ports on most motherboards, so it should be fairly easy to find roughly in that location. And then as a reminder, we've got the RGB connections from the pump, so they can be daisy chained to the connectors from the fan, as you can see me doing, with the little male and female connectors there. And then you run the 3-pin connection to the 5-volt RGB header on the top right there and plug that in. Now, you could theoretically chain these to the RGB connections from the case as well, so you could then connect up everything, but you can use multiple connections on your motherboard if you prefer. And it's worth doing a test boot at this point to make sure everything's running. You can see the case fans are running nicely, the RGB's lighting up and the fans are spinning. And also the cooler display is working and the fans are on there. Then power it off again, and then we're going to go about the graphics card installation. So we need to remove the two PCIe brackets from the back of the case here. This is going to depend on your GPU. Obviously, if you're using a thicker one, you might need to remove more, but I'm using this ASRock Intel GPU, which is only 2 slots. You'll want to make sure you use the top PCIe X16 slot. There's only one on this motherboard, but on some other boards there's more than one. The top one gives you the fastest speed and ensures your GPU works properly. So you want to carefully push that into the socket and secure it down. You should find it clicks into place, and then you can use the little screws that came off those brackets to secure the back of the GPU at the rear there so it's fully seated in. Now for the power cables. So what I tried here initially, and this is one of the downsides with the shift power supply in this case, was to run the power cables down to the bottom so it could come up below the graphics card. But as you can see, there's not quite enough length here because the shift's installed at the top of the case. It's not quite possible to run the power cables through from here. It's just a little bit too tight. You can see it quite do it. This is a little bit of an issue here. Maybe you could do it, but it's just a little bit too tight for my liking. So instead, I came in from the side here. So if you come in from just below the 24-pin power cables are, run your two power connectors through there. You can see we can take them in at an angle. It doesn't look quite as good, but it does work nicely. So pinch those power cables together and push them into the 8-pin port there. And then we're going to plug those cables in. Make sure they're both seated in fully and that the 2-pin part of it isn't loose. That it's fully pushed in there and secured. And then you might want to tidy your cables up a little bit because they're a little bit messy. Now for the little anti-sag bracket on the case, this is actually secured at the rear a little bit and tightened up, and you'll find you can loosen it and then adjust it. What I found with my GPU, because it's only 2 slots, is at the top point of this, it won't actually go high enough to basically slot in below the graphics card. You can flip it over, so you can see it can be turned round. And that was the good solution here that I found. So if you do that and then hold it in place and then retighten it at the rear, you can do that. You'll notice there's also another bracket above it, so you do actually have options. You could just maneuver that top bracket instead into a position that will then be useful. So you do have options on how to do that. Then for SSDs and hard disk drives, so there's a cage at the rear here below the power supply unit. It's secured with 2 small screws at the rear, which as you can see were a bit of a fiddle to get off. And then some additional ones at the back of the case as well that you need to take out. So there's quite a few things to take this out with. It's a bit of a faff to get out. But then when you do get it out, you'll then see that you can install a couple of drives in here fairly easily. So it's a reasonably nice caddy. It has basically screw holes in it that allow you to install 1 SSD, and then you can install hard disk drives into it as well. So for the SSD mounting that basically goes onto the tray itself, make sure the connectors are facing outwards so that you can still plug them in. Line up the holes and then use the screws to secure it in those 4 holes there. You can see you've just got to line those up with the holes on the SSD. I've sped this process up obviously, but then you can see we've got 4 screws securing it to the bottom there. You then have the option to use hard disk drives as well. So I've got one here as a demo. Basically slot that into the cage with the same sort of logic. You want to make sure the connectors are facing outwards. Now, instead of screwing into the bottom, this screws in on the side. You've got 2 screws that screw in on either side of this. So 4 in total to secure the hard disk drive to the caddy as well. And then that's done and it's set up like that. And then you've got 2 drives in there. And then you just need to go about putting it back. You can see that there is space for another hard disk drive if you have it as well. So you can put 3 drives potentially in there, 1 SSD, 2 hard disk drives, and then slot that into the back and secure it again with those small screws and the ones at the rear. So securing all of those. Quite a lot of a process to get that out, put the drives in, get it back in again. But then once you've done that, don't forget power connections from the SATA power from the power supply unit, connect up both those drives, and then you'll need data cables from the motherboard as well, which are these ones. You want to plug those into each of the drives and then run them through and plug them into the motherboard on the right hand side to make sure that you can control the drives and send data to them as well, obviously. So these are hidden away now just below the GPU, but roughly you should find them on the right hand side of most motherboards. You'll usually find 4 ports at least, maybe more depending on your motherboard, and you can plug those in like that and it should find it clicks into place. And now we're getting right near the end of the build, so we're going to re-secure this back bracket. You can see it's got little feet that slot into the rear of the case, and then we need to use those tiny screws from earlier on to then secure that back down. Now obviously once this is in place, all of our cable shame is hidden away, so you don't need to worry if you're not great at cable management, because it's now hidden from view and won't make people cry. And then you can close the rear door on there and secure that as well. And the thumb screws at the rear will tighten that down, so that's held in place. And then pop the top back on as well with the same logic. Slot that in, screw that back on and secure that. And then the glass panel goes on. Now this has plastic on it, obviously you need to peel off as well, so you'll want to do that and make sure that you've got a nice view into the case. Remove that from the glass panels and we've got then the finished product. You can hopefully find a pretty nice build here. Now obviously you have the option to do other things with this. You could add additional fans to the case, and if you've got any sense you'll probably use a white cooler rather than a black one like I did. But I'm still happy with how this came out. You can see I've cable tied the graphics card power cables to neaten them up a bit. But otherwise, the majority of cables are hidden away reasonably well. You can feel free to disagree with me in the comments there. But the case also came out nicely and runs very well as well, reasonably quietly, and looks really good without an additional amount of expense in terms of the fans. Obviously, if you want to, you could buy fans that match a bit more and set it up with all Corsair fans, for example, so you can get some interesting looks and designs with this case. Well, hopefully you found this video useful, gives you some insights into how to build on the case. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions, and check out the description to find out more about this build and other related content. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.